Hi, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, based on what part of the world you're joining us from. We are going to give another minute or so while folks are joining, but today, my name is Smith Patel. I'm the Associate Program Director here at Dime, supporting and overseeing portfolio of activities within our product assessment and innovation portfolio, all the way from evidence, regulatory, and commercialization. And today we are excited and thrilled about a very interesting topic with some incredible experts from the field, all the way bringing perspectives from an investor side, from a clinical scientist, from an innovator and developer side, to dive into something that's really important, as we know in 2023, as the digital health funding is getting tighter and on the shoestring budgets that innovators have to um, develop good evidence and construct that and build products that will have successful market entry, that we look forward to diving into. Before we get started, let's do a quick housekeeping. Today's session is recorded, and the slides and recordings will be available on Time's website in 48 hours. If you have any questions, please don't be shy. We want you to use the live Q&A chat that you have. Please, more the merrier. Any insights, any thoughts that you have, any questions you have for our panelists, we want to hear from you. So you can drop it in the Q&A chat. We'll either type in, and at the end of this session, we have 10 minutes for live Q&A, where we'll bring you on stage and you'll have ability to ask the question. Please note that transcription of this webinar through any of the AI tools is against the policy. And what we'll do instead is you will have the access to the recording and slides, so you can always access it at a later stage. So without further ado, let's get started. What's on tap today? I'll start with a quick setting the stage in 2 to 3 minutes on where we are with the digital health in 2024. We'll have a round robin introduction of our panelists, two short presentations from two of our panelists, and then dive deeper into a great panel discussion on how do we think about in this tight digital health funding space, generating the right evidence, and how do we do that? So let's start with where do we sit at the intersection of digital health in 2024, and what's the pulse there? If you might have not yet seen, but Rock Health came out with this report a few days ago, where they had illustrated the first quarter funding criteria, where $2.7 billion of funding came in Q1 with 133 deals. What was interesting is these were all high value deals with lower check sizes, with an average of 20.6 million. This was also one of the lowest first quarter since 2019 in a pre-pandemic era. While the funding has reduced in the first quarter in the United States in 2024, there were a lot of partnerships that came up, close to 500 partnerships across digital health companies. And as we see these new funding, there were a few different trends that you saw, a huge focus and conversations around ROI and what the return on investment is, and being very real about what are the real outcomes we are talking about when we think about these products and the evidence that we are generating. Huge amount of investment into AI, as everyone might have witnessed and seen across in the industry, but also a lot of trends into exit mindsets, and M&As are coming in with a few bankruptcy that we have seen for organizations earlier this year. Some companies are using creative fundraising that I'm not going to dive into, but we have an expert on a panel today, Steve, who will share all good things about investment trends. What I wanted to share is from the policy front on US is we are seeing a lot of movement on hospital at home systems with new congressional bill that are waiving and supporting acute care delivery at home settings. And right now, some of the bills are in the Senate on their way of getting approved. So we'll see a lot more movement at home care, not only movement from the policy side, but also from the reimbursement, where these care delivery services, we are hoping that American Medical Association's new CPT codings will come out for RPM, or remote patient monitoring. Currently, there are 4 CPT codes that exist for remote patient monitoring, and over 2025 under physician's fee schedule, there's expectation of a few more. Last bit of sunshine for product reimbursement in US. You might have heard that CMS came out with an innovative pathway called TSET, Transitional Coverage of Emerging Technology, last summer. Recently at a conference, Dora Yu, Center Director, pointed out that the agency will come out with this new rule, final rule of TSET that will clarify agencies thinking on what kind of evidence is required by these digital health technologies to qualify for that reimbursement. So stay tuned in summer for more reimbursement approaches. And without further ado, please allow me to welcome our speakers today. And I'm going to go round robin and ask folks, as I see it on the screen, to introduce themselves. Steve, would you like to go first?
Sure, thanks very much. Hello, everyone. I'm Steve Senchens. I'm co-founding partner of PHS Capital based out of Amsterdam. I'm American in Belgium. We focus on individual-centric digital health investment in North America as well as Europe, and have been investing for over a decade with the sole focus of PHS being on digital health.
Thanks, Steve. Glad to have you. Jacqueline?
Yeah, thanks. Hi, everyone. My name is Jacqueline Lutz. I'm currently a research consultant with Luja Consulting LLC. My background is in psychology, neuroscience, originally from the University of Zurich. And the last more than a decade, I spent trying to generate evidence on novel interventions, and then the last 6 years in industry. And I'll go a bit more into detail of the kind of companies I've worked for over the years, but mostly in the digital therapeutic space.
Thanks, Jacqueline. Ben, round us out.
Thank you, Smith. Hi, everyone. Good morning. For me, at least, I'm VP of Science over at Dime. Previously, I'm mentioning it specifically because we're going to be talking a little bit about it. I was Chief Medical Officer at Biteflies. I'm a molecular biologist by training, expertise in physiologic signal processing applied to both preclinical models, intensive care, human intensive care settings. Helped bring various hardware, software, medical devices through both CE pathways in Europe and FDA pathways for use in clinical research and delivery of care. So that's going to be my perspective throughout this conversation. As my last name may give away, I am Belgian. I usually don't say that, but Steve, since you called it out, have been in the US for quite a while now. So we have some interesting geographic crossing paths happening here.
I love it. Ben, I'm not going to be audacious enough to pronounce your last name, but we are glad you are joining us. And this is a fantastic pair. I'm excited to dive in straight in. For our first presentation, Jacqueline, would you like to kick us off? And please give me a visual or verbal cue, and I will move the slides forward for you.
Right. Yeah, thank you so much again for having me. It's really a pleasure. And especially thank you for Dime for keep bringing up these really tough questions. I mean, evidence generation is a very complex question. And even though I've spent the last couple of years, in evidence generation across really leading companies in the PDT space, it remains to be tough. So along this journey, when I reflected what I could present, what kind of observations or learnings might be important to share, it's really, I realized how much comes from this rich cross-functional discussions, working with both experts in the fields with different backgrounds coming from different industries, and really pave new paths together. And so really, Smith told me it's great to show the logos and the products, but ultimately it's the people, right? So basically I'm presenting my journey so far, just so you have a bit of an anchor point of where I'm coming from, whether some of my observations or learnings apply to you or maybe not, right? Because there's so many different products, right? We all know it, they have different scientific underpinnings in different clinical medical use cases. So really there's no standard way of getting the right evidence framework for all of them. So therefore, I'm just briefly sharing a bit more detail of my stations on this journey. So originally, as I mentioned, a PhD in neuroscience and psychology, I studied behavioral interventions using an MRI scanner, but soon got more interested in how does that affect people in real life, and started using technologies like EMA. And that was a bit the seed for me personally to then move into the digital health industry when the opportunity presented with Akili Interactive. That was in 2018. So, funding environment definitely much more favorable. But even then, right, I came around a time where phase 3 was reading out, right, getting ready for regulatory submission, starting to talk to medical providers, parents of children with ADHD, even then, did we have all the best evidence for all our stakeholders? No, right? And sometimes it's at that stage where you learn, oh, in the earlier stages, what could have been good additional studies or ways to start filling those. So after working for Akili Interactive for 2 years, I moved over to Click Therapeutics, mostly to kind of fill my personal pipeline. There I headed more of the R&D, early prototype development team. So we built new products, tested them in very early discovery, at times RCT already, pilot studies. So definitely another very insightful stage in my journey, both from like early discovery, how to potentially optimize that. And I also supported some of the partner programs that Click Therapeutics had with pharma companies, which inspired me to my last move, which was Biogen Digital Health. It was around digital patient solutions, companion applications for novel rapid-acting antidepressants. So slightly adjacent to the digital therapeutics, but still a lot of overlap. And also a lot of overlap with how can we early on, discover and de-risk this type of project that was very novel. And even though Biogen Digital Health, right, was a huge team, it was novel types of initiatives, and all of them needed new processes and ways of thinking about evidence generation. As most of you might be aware, Biogen Digital Health got deprioritized, which led me to my current, very joyful endeavor actually to provide some of the learnings to mostly digital therapeutics and everything that we'll touch on, like product innovation and evidence generation strategy. So you see quite a slur of like types of evidence generation and therapeutic indication I've worked on, but really, like, I hope this can be an exchange of learnings, because the more you know, the less you understand, right? And definitely, I think we all in the field, it's so complex that we can only move ahead by sharing the learnings. So next slide. So really, I don't want to go too much into details here. There's no accepted framework for evidence generation for all digital health technologies. And my view comes from this maybe more pharma adjacent kind of model of discovery, pilot, RCT, and then real world evidence. And this might or might not apply to you, obviously. But what I've noticed across several discussions is that often like this big RCT at the end, right? Everyone like focuses on that, and obviously it's expensive and needs resources, and it's important to plan for. But for me, evidence generation is more like, can you click one, Smith? Thinking about evidence, really thinking more about growing evidence, right? And putting the seeds for your key endpoints you want at that end for your RCT, for example, to start exploring these and de-risking these early. And also think about evidence generation. It's kind of almost a muscle you want to build. Yeah, next slide. So if we look a little bit at the early stage of evidence generation, at least from my observations, it's probably worth spending some time and generate some evidence on what's actually needed. That might be straightforward, but even then, like, your key stakeholders, they might have all kinds of wishes. But really, like, spending time on figuring out what's the key evidence and the strength that will be needed for your key stakeholders at which stage. So that's one area. Like, there's a lot of endpoints, which one to select for. And the next part is like, often there's already, some interesting data there. Obviously not the most strong evidence. But it's worth looking into them and have people with different backgrounds look into them, so you can shape your narrative and establish your expertise in the therapeutic area and digital health in that therapeutic area. And then once you compare these two, you can see the gaps, right? In areas you want to de-risk, right? For example, there might be several quality of life metrics, unfortunately, right? Which one to pick? And obviously, you talk with scientific clinical advisors, but also you might need to de-risk and test different endpoints in this stage. So really everything to de-risk your RCT. And seeing this as a way of collecting signals along the way of growing your evidence and steering it in a slightly different direction if the signals, start to die out. Overall, for me personally, this was a more creative period. I might have seen trials that look with the same new prototype across different indications, almost like a basket trial design that we are familiar with in oncology trials. I've seen us tagging on initial like ePro type of questions to more like user research studies, and just, look at the initiatives you already have and how can you start tagging on those evidences you will need further down the road. But really also plan ahead, and that also goes for dissemination, right? The evidence you generate still might be worth publishing. And I've also often in this stage heard this argument of like, oh, this is not research, right? Without maybe asking IRB, can this be exempt? Should we already consider this as a survey, like as a type of research? And often this is a shortcut that once the data is in and you see, oh, there's something interesting that could establish our thought leadership. It might be too late to then make it publishable. So I don't want to go into technicalities here, but it's just make sure if you can be more creative here, knowing your evidence strength is not the strongest, but you want to plan ahead, and there's some key signals and nuggets that you might already want to use. Next slide. Yes, that, before we enter the scary RCT phase, I just want to call out, this is not just me, like several authors have discussed this jump is maybe an area of innovation that we could discuss together, as well as like, this initial evidence by nature might not fully de-risk, your later stage, and the later stage is significant effort and time and money. So are there more innovative ways in this middle section, right, from adaptive phase 2-3 trials to simulations, digital twins? Like, I'm not obviously an expert in all of them, but like I feel this jump is a scary jump, and for a good reason. So when you go into RCTs in phase 3, yes, thank you. You're obviously dealing with large, often complex trials, significant timelines and resources that you got to spend. And it really here it's more about the operations. And it's a bit of an art, right? Every trial will have their own kind of cost factors. So really, like for me personally, talking to experts, clinical operation experts, also clinical operation experts who've done digital trials, it's really, there's some key differences and things you can leverage because of the digital nature of many of these trials and hybrid or remote trials you can run. But it's complex. So it's an art, and you need the experts to do the art right? But taking a step back, our technologies are often used for pharma to speed up their trials, to make it more patient-centric. So, some startups or scale-ups in this environment might look into what can we do in-house, right? We have expertise in technology. In the healthcare space, can we build some of these capabilities in-house? Can we do some of the clinical operations in-house? And you might find your internal superpowers to run these trials or to support them. Examples here are like recruitment can be a significant cost factor, but your internal marketing teams, your designers, can do wonderful jobs in making your trial, in bringing your trial to potential participants in some instances. I already alluded to your technology. Maybe the app can have a small ePro in there. Can there be pre-screening phases in the app or in a study website that you designed that will keep your funnel lean so you can handle it faster? So again, a lot of technicalities. My point here is like you can look for internal helpers and use their expertise. But again, obviously, this is really, with this complexity, you also want to look beyond internal strength. Next stage. next, yes. And so really, again, reflecting on my journey and learnings, it's a group endeavor, and you want to find your friendly scientists. Caveat there, obviously, they often want to have more rather than less data. So really like ask for the why and the prioritization. Academics are wonderful partners, right? They can help you test your innovation in new indications, for example, investigator-initiated trials, can help you write up your papers. So there's a lot of like shared interest there. I've seen many academics wanting to work with industry and gain that experience. If you want to run a trial, while obviously ultimately we want to reach all healthcare providers, finding sites and PIs that have experience with digital health might really make a significant difference in conducting trials. Finding your early adopters to give you feedback without too much complexity. And with larger industries, even like at Biogen, some wonderful learnings of like, core functions that really understand the processes, even in more complex situations like pharma, can help you think outside the box. How within our framework, within the regulations, can we advance your novel product? You will find these people, and it's wonderful to see the support as they help you move the field forward. And then obviously, ultimately, Diamond bringing together conversations like this. I'm really looking forward to all the learnings that we've gathered as we're trying to get the best evidence in an efficient way.
Thanks, Jacqueline. That was a very comprehensive, and really appreciate you sharing your experiences across multiple different companies who build some of the leading digital health, and combining some of them into three main ones that really stood to me is how do we de-risk some of these digital health products as you think about early in the product development cycle, thinking through turning your marketing team into trial recruitment, because we know how hard and challenging it is to have the right patients who adhere to those. And then how do we think about various kinds of evidence on different stakeholders and having a strategy to address various needs. So with that, I want to jump next on presentation from Ben.
All right, thank you, Smith, and thank you, Jacqueline, because you really kind of teed me up nicely here. I think I'm going to be touching on some of the things that you mentioned also, kind of highlighting the fact that we are converging on some ideas, which is a good sign. The slightly pretentious title, not intentional, is evidence generation as a continuum. I think, Jacqueline, again, you kind of pointed that out already, and I want to continue highlighting it because that's the reality of it when you're in the thick of it. It is a continuum. I mean, you're continuously trying to improve on your strategy of building evidence. But at the same time, there are these kind of seismic shifts. Often it's easier to see those kind of in hindsight if you have the ability to kind of zoom out and see, why did we take that path there? Why there was a fork in the road? Why did we decide to go left? Were we even aware that there was a right path when we were discussing this? So what I'm going to try to do on the next slide is give a bit of a schematic overview of what a road like that could look like. In no way am I trying to say that this is a catch-all be-all kind of example. It is really it is based on personal experience to some extent, but it is really just one example just to get the conversation going. So assume that you have a company that developed or is developing a DHT and they want to position it as DHT for research, clinical research. Again, as Jacqueline pointed out, in those early stages of product development, your evidence generation is going to be kind of foundational focused. What I mean by that, it's going to depend on the type of technology, the majority of the technology. Are you grabbing something off the shelf? Are you developing from scratch, and so forth? But there's going to be a lot of pilots. There's going to be probably collaborations with academic partners to kind of get you through that stage. And then at some point, you may, a pharma company or another sponsor of a trial may show interest in what you've built, and you think like, okay, great, let's do this, right? Let's put this thing into a trial and learn from that and move on from there and continue building. First hurdle that you will run into that many people on the call here are probably familiar with. I can tell you that the first time we went through this process, it came as a bit of a surprise that you have this vendor procurement process thing, which is a pretty heavy-handed let's call it a checklist that a sponsor will make you go through to make sure that they can, cross all their T's, dot all their I's. There's some evidence component in there, but it's very much focused on risk mitigation, right? And next, please. What we noticed, and what I know from peers in the field that they've noticed too, is that your original enthusiasm to really go into that trial is going to be blocked by the sponsor telling you, like, we would like you to have, and when they say we would like you to have, they mean you should have a QMS, right? Like either a 13485 certificate or something similar. And you may need to actually go through a regulatory pathway. Can you click next, please? Now, the regulatory pathway, it's really going to be dependent on the type of technology and what you're trying to do with it. In many cases, though, if not all cases, it is almost never a requirement to go through a regulatory pathway if you're developing something for clinical research, right? We all know that now. I think back in the day, talking 5+ years ago, people knew that too. But at the same time, everything that is evidence related in these kind of three first blocks on the slide, or two first blocks on the slide, was murky. It's still a little bit murky. It's gotten better, but it was very murky at the time. So for a sponsor, you also needed a way to make sure that whatever you were thinking of putting in a trial had been vetted appropriately from a safety and a performance perspective, right? And a regulatory pathway, even though it may have been a very heavy-handed instrument, or it is a very heavy-handed instrument, depending on what you're trying to do, is something that was expected because it was the clearest path forward, although not necessarily the easiest one, the cheapest one, and the shortest one to the shared objective. So as you go down this list, of course, the evidence requirements are going to ramp up, especially if you start talking about regulatory pathways. It's going to depend on the geography that you want to launch in and all of those things. As Jacqueline already pointed out, a randomized clinical trial may be necessary. It may also be overkill, right? There's absolutely a lot of people that are evaluating and have worked with kind of innovative ways to avoid the RCT, but that's obviously not always going to be necessary. And it is not so much about avoiding an RCT as it is about what is the most optimal way to generate the evidence that I need for this next step. Next, please. Okay, thank you. And of course, at the end of that chain, if you in a startup environment, if you actually survived up until this point, you've definitely proven that you can kind of on the fly develop an evidence strategy and continuously adapt to the changing needs of the moment. And then you get to the stage where you have to actually generate revenue, right? Some companies will focus on research applications, clinical research applications. Others will focus on clinical care, some on both. But the fact remains that and that's what the upward arrow is trying to kind of crudely illustrate, that this is still not the end of the line, right? Here, as a company, you got to keep innovating. You're adding new features. You're learning from market shifts that are happening to accommodate them. And you are going to have to go through this process again. Of course, as you've done it once, as you've done it a second time, your processes are going to be able to get better and better at it. And you're going to be able to speed this up. But getting through this kind of first cycle, closing the loop to something that is actually launched on the market is often an absolutely critical step that a company needs to get to. And so kind of to summarize this slide, as I kind of pointed out at and on the title slide, and as Jacqueline also pointed out, this really is a continuum. But when you have the opportunity to kind of zoom out and look back at what happened, there are these very, seismic shifts that happen depending on the path that you choose. That is very much, or usually, driven by market forces, by business opportunities, and so forth. And as long as you can continuously adapt to those changing needs, you have a chance of success here. But so the main reason I'm pointing all of this out is that if I think back 5+ years when we were piecing this all together, the regulatory guidance, the QMS guidance and regulations and certifications were already fairly robust when we're talking about digital health technologies. But everything else required kind of this kind of scrappy startup attitude to figure things out as you go, right? And to run into walls frequently. Next slide. And click again, please. Thank you. And again, from the perspective of thinking back, and especially from the perspective of Dime now, so what Dime has done over the last 5 years is generate a lot of resources that really go at the heart of all of these problems that the field collectively is trying to figure out, right? Click again. And that's the last time, I promise. As you can see here on the slide, all of these logos are Dime resources that are currently available on the website, and they all kind of sit, roughly speaking, in some parts of this flow as you go through it as a company. If I think back on, if those resources would have been available when we got started, it's not that those resources would have spelled out the path that a particular company needs to take, right? But it would definitely have removed a lot of the guessing. It would have allowed you to kind of map out the possibilities and know, kind of lift the fog of war and know which opportunities and which pathways are there for evidence generation, for interacting with regulators, for interacting with sponsors, for interacting with various stakeholders in this entire process, and also kind of having this bi-directional communication with them to make sure that, let's say, if a sponsor of a trial is adamant that you absolutely have to go through a 510(k) clearance with FDA to have, a better understanding as a field about what that means, where it may apply for, where it doesn't legally per se apply, but where it may apply from a practical perspective, but also where it may not, where an RCT applies, but where it may not, so that we're all learning from that and having the ability to start moving faster, not having to reinvent the wheel over and over again, but having these shared open source resources that everybody can kind of settle on as a base and then continue building from there. And what I have on the slide here are only the resources that have been completed. There are many more over on Dime side in the pipeline that are going to expand on a lot of these gaps in knowledge that still exist when we're talking about the evidence generation. All right, that's what I had. I hope this was helpful and will kind of help spark some of the conversation in the second part.
Thank you, Ben. Really appreciate that. And I always think of you as the mastermind who brings multiple different perspectives all at in one slide. And thank you for collating into that one slide on evidence generation. And I really love the continuum cycle, because evidence is not one-stop shop. As product develops, evidence develops, and we move forward into building that product and deploying it in the market. So thank you for doing that. Steve, welcome back. You have also been very patient, and I want to start with you for our panel discussion as we think about, you see this as an investor partner with PHS, investing into digital health startup. What are some kinds of trends that you are seeing that are impacting digital health startups in the current phase? Any insights to kick us off for today's conversation?
Well, I'll try with a few insights. I think everybody likes to have, those short buzzwords or short things that are very simple and puts everything in a nice box with a bow on top. But and if I had a crystal ball, that would be the most brilliant thing ever. But I think one of the biggest aspects, and I've been doing this, as mentioned, for over a decade now. Everybody tends to focus on the pandemic period because so much funding went into things. And if you really take a look and take the pandemic era out, the funding is trajecting upward and forward. But I think that, a few simple things to keep in mind is really about focus and fundamentals today. We've come from an era where have a dream and a vision, and money will flow, to what is this really about, and how are you going to get your first customer sets, and how are you going to build this step by step versus one big bang. And so that's not sexy. It's not, out there. It's work, and that's what entrepreneurialism is, and building business is work. And I think those that really spend the time to focus in on what's my first step, what do I really need to accomplish here, and what's going to be my next step, and being able to articulate that is incredibly important. Of course, the other trend, and it's all over the place, but people will ask you, how are you, if in your proposition you're going to be utilizing AI? And even in investment term sheets and things, you're seeing, the use of AI and that coming in, as aspects that haven't been there prior to the last year. So that's really something new and different. But AI is real. For me, it's a bit old. I've invested in AI over 10 years ago, so it seems like it's just coming to fruition, but that's kind of the buzz thing. The other aspect that's maybe more near and dear to me, but I think relevant across the board, is this is about health, and health should really move towards access. And I think those propositions that can really increase access, affordability, and this goes broad. And I'll bring into that as well the whole holistic health, or the holistic approach. In that, yes, you may be solving for one thing, but what's really causing that one thing? And I think access with that, these really get to how do you drive outcomes, and in the end, this is what it's all about. So I'll pause there. Food for thought.
Absolutely, Stephen. I wish we all could have a crystal ball, because that would help us. That will help investors invest in companies that will succeed, but also innovators in terms of understanding what evidence exists. Steve, you brought up a really good point around starting with the first customer and building the evidence as a step-by-step process. Jacqueline and Ben, I want to go to you next. As you were thinking through some of the products within your past organizations, building these products, where and how early stage startup get started? Like, what are some of the things and strategies that they should be thinking about once they have a proof of concept, they are going into and getting their first customer base and building their product? Any insights there?
Yeah, I can, it's the great question. Hard to answer for all the products and all the customers out there, leading me back to that original, like, spend some time and generate evidence on the evidence you need for your key stakeholders, right? And that obviously includes the end customer, right? What is meaningful, what is valuable to them. And I think over time, not just in digital, but also in pure pharma, like, we see a shift towards more e-pros, more pragmatic outcomes. So that's another, like, seismic shift or things we're working through, right? And for example, the Achille example I mentioned, having that rigorous large RCT, but some of the questions we got, I can become more concrete, is really like, okay, how does that help my child at school, right? So I think that's sometimes hard to de-risk, but overall, any of these technologies or pharmaceutical innovations will have to answer that meaning for the end user a bit more proactively. But I think digital has an advantage there, right? We can tap into experiences earlier and slightly easier if we can crack the engagement. If the engagement's good enough, we can get early signals.
Yeah, just very briefly, just to kind of pile on what Jacqueline is saying, because it's very much the same theme. There's no one size fits all, right? It's going to very much depend on what is the thing that what is your mission, what is your vision, what do you want to accomplish. To kind of piggyback off what Steve was saying, it's hopefully it's outcome focused and it's access focused, but it also depends on the like if you're primarily clinical care or primarily clinical research, right? Like we all like to think that when you develop something for clinical research, that it is focused on access and outcomes, but in reality, the forces that are going to drive you in a certain direction are not necessarily that. Whereas in clinical care, they absolutely should be. So that's also kind of a deliberate choice you have to make, and your evidence generation strategy is going to be very different. Whereas if you're really going to go towards clinical care, it's going to be more, there's going to be this potentially huge effort at the end of the chain if you need to go down the reimbursement pathway, right? And if you didn't think of that early enough, the gap between getting market access and getting paid for what you build can be so large that it is incredibly hard to overcome as a startup, and then depending on how much money you have in the bank. So these are all things where the funding side and the evidence generation side kind of intertwine with each other, and it's always easy after the fact to say, like, we should have thought of that, because in the moment it's not always easy to have the ability to kind of zoom out and have that perspective, or have the right guidance and advisors that coach you on that. But yeah, that's definitely something those early decisions and how they link to your mission statement as a company are critical.
Absolutely. Ben, you mentioned something that addressing expectations, and I think this ties in with what Jacqueline was also talking about, is evidence expectation across different stakeholders are a little different. And Steve, I want to come to you because you have invested in a lot of these startups over so many years, over a decade. When you think about from an investor's perspective, for the evidence or requirements, be it regulatory or non-regulatory requirements that you look at, are there anything that comes to mind, knowing that right now digital health is under so much scrutiny that there's no good evidence that exists in products and solutions out in the market? How do you evaluate? What are the things you think about while assessing some of these products or organizations, startups?
So yeah, I think it's been stated here quite a bit, and I like how both Ben and Jacqueline have used what is the evidence you need for where you're going. So often it can get into evidence for the sake of evidence, which what is that really bringing? And so it starts with first, I think, assessing the proposition and what are you trying to accomplish with it. And then the next aspect, it's been stated here quite a bit, but out of the box thinking. I really liked how Jacqueline showed, you're growing it as you move forward. And it's not so much how do we do it all at once, or, that big golden standard RCT type of thing, but maybe some smaller flags are planted that allows you to get in. Because the real aspect is it's all about trust, data. Data is trust. And how much of that do you need for what you're trying to accomplish? And so there is not one size fits all, as Ben was saying. It is really, this is the proposition. What are we trying to achieve? And what do we need for now? And what can be built upon, and how can these be built upon as we move forward? I think the other aspect that's digital really allows itself to, and it's been stated, but how do you get some of this greater population health data brought into this? And not so much I've done a trial with 50 people and this is the outcome, but I've done a trial with several hundred and in real world situations, which is very, very powerful. So, I think that is the basis when it's back to focus and basics and really planning. Your evidence is very important, as is other parts of the business, but it gets to how have you planned that as part of the overall and building it as you move forward.
Steve, I love that. I'm so glad you brought population health data, because I think this has been increasingly important in terms of what we have seen on purchasers and payers. A lot of industry has been tired of pilotitis on evidence that has been shown for 10 patients to 100 patients versus when innovators are talking to payers for reimbursement and purchasers, there is an expectation of showcasing that population level evidence or population level data, or real world outcomes data. And there's a dichotomy into that, having shoestring budget to also deliver evidence that works for a larger population. So I want to come to this panel to see if there are any strategies or examples in the past that has successfully worked for this that we can share with the audience on how to build efficiency in this evidence generation, either planning or development stage of the product, that might seem helpful to consider both gaps. Yes, we want to generate evidence with the tightest budget that we have, but also support some larger scale. And if I put it in a clinical study context.
I could try to take a stab at that.
It's the chicken and an egg question, and I don't have an answer. That's why I get
There's like a million answers to that one.
Yeah.
Just to kind of get first thing, and it's a massive cliche, but it's a cliche for a reason. You got to have the team, right? You got to have people that have, at the very least, prior experience running evidence generation. It can be academic, not, or, industry, but having a kick-ass team of engineers that do not have exposure to how evidence is generated, especially on human subjects, is going to make things difficult, to say the least. Second thing I would say, kind of flipping things around a little bit, is that especially if you're thinking about products that are meant to deliver care, that are to be used in clinical care, there's also the role of the payer in all of this. What I'm going to say next is very biased by a more European style single payer system. But what I've seen happen in the past is that even if you're, as a developer, building kind of a Me Too product, really shouldn't use that phrase in that context. That got polluted, but you know what I mean. You're building something that is already out there. You're building a competing product that is supposed to be better than what's out there, obviously, but in terms of what's already available for reimbursement codes, for pathways, for clinical workflows, the field's kind of settled, or at least there's a good basis to start from, right? And you want to plug into that. Even there, I've seen it happen firsthand that the payer will have very little to no information on the actual population health aspects of this, in terms of what has been done so far. How are these codes being utilized? And obviously everybody has utilization information, but like down to the level of actually knowing, are we improving outcomes based on the work that has happened in this field over the last 10, 15 plus years, right? And you come in with a new technology and you say, like, you as a payer, you are willing to pay us for this based on this code. You're asking us to do, some kind of analysis or set the stage how this is going to improve things. We want data from you that we can plug into on where the real needs are expressed in euros or dollars. And it's simply not available in many cases. So I don't know, Steve, if that's the point you were trying to make. I don't think so. I'm just kind of riffing off it. Yeah. That there is kind of the need for these two worlds to really come closer together and reinforce each other, right? Like all this technology allows us to collect way more data now than it did before. But making that data actionable from a population health perspective is something that is still severely lacking across many domains. And that is not something that a single startup or a single company is going to solve. That really requires an ecosystem to come together, not only on the developer side.
Yeah, if I could just dovetail off of how you open this up, I think the other thing I would bring in, and when you say ecosystem, for me it becomes smart partnerships. Who has a stake in this for success, as opposed to I have an idea and just kind of driving it all the way through. which partners can you bring around the table with you? And that will bring greater data, but also reduce cost as a whole. And I think too often that's not thought deeply enough about. And perhaps, you know, it's effort, it's work, but really can bring, I think, better results.
Absolutely. Steve, if I can dovetail on that, going on more solution-oriented mindset, and colleagues on the call, if you have questions, please feel free to drop it in the chat and Q&A, and I'll make sure those are looped into as they come in. Steve, as innovators are thinking through in 2024, are there any things that they can do or opportunities that they have to differentiate themselves to attract funding as they move forward, as they're in their seed round A's and B's? In this time, knowing that it's a tighter market, knowing the scrutiny is high, knowing expectations for delivery is also high. Any opportunities comes to mind for these startups that they should think about as they seek funding this year?
Yeah. Well, I think first it gets back to focus again. You know, that you've really thought through what is it you need now? What is it you want to accomplish now? And what is the funding you truly need, not want, but need to accomplish that? I think that's really a big thing. And the other aspect comes down to what kind of, back to what kind of evidence can you show me towards outcomes? Even, you know, maybe it's not fully proven, but what are the pathways, and what does this mean? And that you can show me a basis that this will be realized from an investment perspective. And I think, you know, it all depends at the stage you're at in what you're trying to pull together. But I think these two aspects, because again, at the end of the day, why is this all being done? It's for outcomes. That's simple.
Absolutely. Going back to the ROI and the outcomes, we mentioned about investment, we mentioned about evidence, and I'm feeling a little bit brown today, a little spicy. So we are going to do with, there's a question that's came up a few days ago in a conversation and a discussion, is who should actually bear the burden of the cost for evidence when it comes to these digital health products? Let's go there. If anyone wants to chime in.
Wow. That's that one's a thorny one. But I think, you know, just bearing the cost, I think it is one attribute to it. I think it's first off, really maybe an assessment of, again, in a deeper assessment of what kind of evidence is really necessary for what we're trying to generate as an outcome. And I think too often it gets caught into the 99%. If you're doing population health management and you're trying to just triage people in, of course you can't miss. But what is the accuracy, you know, you need in something in trying to do this type of aspect? So I would start with first maybe who's you ask who's going to pay, but maybe really what are we trying to prove with evidence? Where are we trying to go with this? And a real dialogue on that, because I think when that happens, you'll start adjusting some of these cost curves too in evidence generation that comes to play. And the other thing I think in this is, I had alluded to it a bit, is the partnership aspect that comes to play. You know, placing all this aspect on a startup who is trying to bring something to an underserved area and saying, prove everything to me at a very high level is a bit restrictive, perhaps, for where we are today and what digital has been discussed, digital technologies allow for. So I think we're still in the adjustment period of what kind of evidence do we need around digital? versus the traditional type of medicines we have seen. And this will prove itself out. But I'm not going to take maybe a very political stance and make a statement who should pay. I would say maybe more of everybody should pay.
Steve, I love that you brought up the partnerships again. That was, it's a tough question, right? But smart partnerships, I loved how you coined that. And another aspect here is like, who can get the fruit, the value in 5 to 10 years that these innovations bring, right? Again, like farmers looking to technology to speed up their own and differentiate their own pipeline. So these partnerships can both bear some of the costs, but also then get the value. So who can get the value down the line, right? And as someone who's worked in R&D, obviously, like I understand, being focused, but there's something to be said also about innovation. And maybe one strategy that we haven't brought up here is also a non-dilutive government funding for these, just keeping some fresh innovation going into these digital health startups while they're trying to hit the focused, number one outcome for the partnership, for the adoption. Just as an additional thought.
Absolutely. Thank you. And Ben, I'm gonna put you on a hold. We have a question come in from Justin, who is providing that minimum amount of evidence necessary and understanding on those minimum amount of evidence necessary for decision making, as we think about from strategy side, product development side, business decisions. Any thoughts to close us out there?
Well, I guess it's a bit parallel to what we were just saying about, who pays for it, right? Like it's everyone, and it depends on the specific case, right? Like if you have to pass by a regulatory agency, then it's clear, right? They're going to determine it. They set the bar. If you don't have to go through that kind of pathway, or if you're too early stage for that, it is going to be very much decided by, like, honestly, I think it's as simple as what is a good scientific rationale for why this amount of evidence proves to, beyond a reasonable doubt that this is what you're doing, right? That you're measuring the right thing, that the signal you're picking up is robust enough for that specific application. So for me, from my perspective, it's very much a scientific question, regardless of if there's always a business component, there's always a strategy component to it, but at the core of it, it's a scientific question.
Absolutely. That was a really good call out, and I'm gonna, recognizing we have 2 minutes remaining, share what's next from these conversations, because these are one of many that we are going to continue to drive towards as we think about bringing new novel digital health products in the market. And Justin, if you might have not seen, but Dime has launched an integrated evidence plan for digital health products, a project that is convening regulators, payers, implementers, developers all together to identify those core minimum standards all the way from clinical, regulatory, purchaser requirements in this standard to understand what's the minimum evidence requirement that we should have as we think about bringing products to the market. So stay tuned on more resources to come out in March 2025. Our next webinar series next month is focused on, as a part of the Data CC Digital Measurement Collaborative, we'll focus on digital measurement for nocturnal scratch for atopic dermatitis, and how do we use digital sensing tools to objectively measure nocturnal scratch for patients with atopic dermatitis. This is a series of 3 that will focus on regulatory feedback all the way from R&D for algorithm tools, and then processes and validation of these tools. Last but not the least, Dime and FDA would be co-hosting next month a public meeting and a public workshop of how do we use patient-generated health data for medical device development. So there would be many case examples where companies and organizations have implemented this patient-generated health data for product development throughout the total product lifecycle. So if you're interested, please stay tuned and join in alongside Dime and FDA. Last but not the least, I want to say thank you. Thank you, Steve, Jacqueline, Ben, for joining us today, sharing and lending your time, but also sharing incredible insights. And thank you to everyone who joined today. we hope this was helpful for you as you think about generating evidence and building new product strategies. And we look forward to seeing you at the next DIME webinar.